had benefited from a post-war renewal, the working-class suburb that they all lived in had not. The members of Black Sabbath then grew up in the shadows of steel factories, hearing the sounds and rhythms of the machinery. To be clear, this was a tough factory town, where they were surrounded by violence and pollution. This dirty, rough environment then influenced the type of music that they played. According to Iommi, quote, "The particular area we all lived in was not very nice, really. There were some nice people around, but there was a lot of gangs and things like that. It was a bit depressing. Being able to play music really lifted us from what we were involved in where we lived. I think it also had an influence on what came out of us because it was aggressive music." Now, the part there about their music lifting them up was crucial, as the options for the young people of Birmingham were limited to say the least. You could work in a factory or you could be in a gang, while some did both. Iommi and Butler, for example, worked in factories after leaving school, while Ward delivered Cole and Osborne, who dropped out of school at 15, worked jobs like as a plumber's assistant and killing cows in a slaughterhouse. Mind you, one of those sounds a lot better than the other, but unsurprisingly with so few options, Ozzy tried his hand at petty theft, which he apparently wasn't good at, as he would be convicted of theft for robbing a clothing store, a crime which landed him in jail for 6 weeks when he was unable to pay the fine. Ozzy at that point decided that a future in the world of crime wasn't in the cards, so he decided to try music, hoping to follow in the footsteps of other young Brits like the Beatles. For the future members of Black Sabbath then, music provided a way for them to escape the gangs and the various working-class jobs that weren't their only options in life otherwise. While this tough, hardscrabble, and violent hometown would influence the emotions behind the music they played, the Birmingham factories would also have a huge influence on one member's playing style in particular. You see, guitarist Tony Iommi had been set to quit his factory gig when he was just 17 years old, after being invited to join a band called the Birds and Bees. This was a real professional gig. According to Tony, they were a good band, which he would compare to the Hollies just with 2 female singers. Indeed, they were so good they were set to go on a tour of Europe. So Tony had seemingly found this ticket out of working in Birmingham's factories. However, on his last day of work, the person who normally worked the sheet metal press didn't show up. So Tony the Welder became Tony the press worker for the day, except he had no training and no experience. Now, the morning had gone by without incident, and he had even gone home for lunch, at which point he told his mother that he was done, but she made him go back to leave properly, and that's when it happened. Iommi would describe what happened next, quote, "They put me on this giant huge press, a guillotine-type press, that would come down bang and bend the metal. So I'm there with this huge machine and I don't know what happened. I must have pushed my hand in. Bang, it came down. It just took the ends off. It actually pulled them off. As I pulled my hand back, it sort of pulled them off. I was left with 2 stalks. The bone was sticking out the top of the finger." Tony Iommi, on what was supposed to be his last day working in the Birmingham factories before setting off to make music as a guitarist, just had the tips ripped off 2 of his fingers. This was a nightmare, as according to Tony, upon being taken to the hospital, quote, "They cut the bones off and then they said, you might as well forget playing." Tony was understandably upset at this turn of events. Not only did he love music, but it was supposed to have been his way out. He couldn't believe it, and he couldn't accept that he would never be able to play again. It was during this time that a friend of his brought Tony a record to try and cheer him up. At first, Tony didn't want to listen to it. Music at that moment was not comforting. It was just a reminder of what he had lost. But his friend insisted, and told him the recording was of Django Reinhardt. Now, Iommi would be impressed by what he heard on the record, but more importantly, he would be inspired when his friend told him why he picked this specific artist. You see, on the 2nd of November 1928, 18-year-old Django, after a night of playing music at a new club, returned home to the caravan that was the home of himself and his new wife. A caravan that was notably filled with the celluloid flowers that his wife had crafted to sell at the market on the following day. Before turning in for the night, though, Django heard a sound coming from among the flowers. Thinking it was a mouse, Django, with candle in hand, bent down to look. As he did, the lit wick from the candle fell into the highly flammable celluloid flowers. The caravan then was almost instantaneously transformed into a raging inferno. Somehow, though, both Django and his wife would make it across the blazing room to safety outside, but his left hand and his right side from his knee to his waist were badly burned. Django would be bedridden for 18 months due to the severity of his burns, which included his severely burned left hand that left his ring and pinky fingers permanently curled to his palm due to the tendons in those digits shrinking from the heat of the fire. During this time in bed, Django with great determination would create a whole new style of playing guitar, built around what he could and could not do with his left hand that only had two fully functional fingers left. While he could still use his ring and pinky fingers to form chords or octaves on the bottom two strings of his guitar, full extension of those digits wasn't possible, which left Django only able to solo with his index and middle fingers, yet still he went on to be known as one of the greatest jazz guitarists of all time. Inspired by this story, Tony was determined to also do whatever it took to be able to play again. In his case, with two fingers shortened, it was difficult to play chords normally, but that wasn't his greatest hindrance. You see, as a result of the accident, there was now on those two damaged fingers only a layer of skin covering the bone of those fingertips, so trying to press down on the strings with those fingers was extremely painful. Tony then tried talking to some specialists, but they gave him no hope. So he decided to figure out how he was going to do this himself. Iommi's first step involved melting down a plastic soap bottle into a ball that he fit onto his finger. He then slowly molded and shaped the plastic ball into a fingertip-like shape. This, however, still didn't work when it came to playing guitar, so he tried gluing some strips of leather onto his makeshift fingertips, and just like that he could play again. Now it was still painful and difficult because he could obviously no longer feel the strings or the frets through these makeshift fingertips, but it was a start. Next, to make it easier to depress the strings, Tony filed down the frets, and also made his own set of light guitar strings using banjo strings. When all was said and done, this accident would play a critical role in the sound that would define Black Sabbath. According to Iommi, quote, "It helped to make me play a different style, because I couldn't play the conventional way. I couldn't play the proper chords like I could before the accident, so I had to come up with a different way of making a bigger sound." Now, Black Sabbath wasn't just a reflection of their hardscrabble working-class surroundings, as they were also a dark mirror to the 60s and its hippie culture. The band's working-class anger, sludgy grooves, and ominous subject matter of war, horror, mental illness, and death were a stark contrast to the peace and love of the more mainstream, happy, hopeful, psychedelic music of the 60s. Tony Iommi would describe the band's philosophy, quote, "Everybody in the world was all on about the good things that were happening. It was all flower power and everything is all jolly. And on the other side of it, nobody was talking about people getting blown up, just the other side. You got the good and the evil, and no one was talking about the evil, so it just seemed the ideal thing to talk about, really." Bill Ward would explain why they felt that way, quote, "Peace and love was not necessarily our reality. We came from Aston, which is a pretty rough and tough area in Birmingham, and there wasn't a whole lot of flowers being handed out in Aston. You know, there were a few boots and a kick in the head, every once in a while a few razor cuts. It was a tough town. We were just reflecting on what our reality really felt like." Ozzy, too, would echo this sentiment as he stated, quote, "When I was a kid, I was hungry. I had my ass hanging out of my pants." So it was hard for him in industrial Birmingham to connect with the happy, hopeful message of flower power while, quote, "My father was dying of asbestos from industrial pollution." The world of hippies and flower power wasn't their reality. As Geezer Butler would also recall, quote, "It was always the hippie happy stuff on the radio, and there we were in Aston, having to go to work in factories. We wanted to put how we thought about the world at the time. We didn't want to write happy pop songs. We gave that industrial feeling to it." Essentially, then, the happy, hopeful, loving music of the 60s didn't reflect what their lives were like, so they made music that spoke to their experiences. To create a sound that was different from the hippie, love, and flower power music that didn't resonate with them, Butler and Iommi turned to their love of horror films, and this decision is what gave the group its signature stirring sound. According to Iommi, quote, "We wanted to create a vibe like you get off horror films, try and create a tension within the music. We thought it would be really good to get this sort of vibe, this fear and excitement." The way they created this feeling can best be illustrated with the song that bears the same name as the band itself. If all the notes he hits in that slow, ominous riff were played at the same time, it would be wholly discordant. A chord that 18th century music scholars dubbed the devil in music. For some real quick basic music theory, your basic chord is your root, a third, and a fifth. A third and a fifth are examples of intervals, or the difference between two notes in a scale. This is a 1 and a 3. This is a 1 and a 5. And this is a 1, a 3, a 5 in the octave, making your basic major chord. While that combination of notes sounds pleasing to our ears, there are others that aren't. The diminished fifth is quite the opposite, sounding particularly dissonant as it creates a feeling of tension because it feels unresolved, like you're waiting for that second note to transition into one that sounds like it belongs, a note that is more harmonious, which is what makes the trill Iommi does in the riff especially effective, as it's teasing the listener with the more acceptable sounding note. Now, during the medieval period, when music was being written for the church, the goal of the music was to reveal the beauty of God's creation. So anything that didn't sound beautiful was against this philosophy. As a result, this combination of notes became known as the devil's tritone or the devil's interval, or diabolus in musica, the devil in music. It wasn't necessarily outright banned, but it was most definitely discouraged, because it did not help the music serve the purpose it was intended for. Later, classical composers like Beethoven and Wagner, for example, would make use of this tritone to create tension in their music. One composer, Gustav Holst, would write a piece called Mars the Bringer of War from his suite The Planets that would feature prominently in its first section a root note, its octave, and its diminished fourth, the tritone, a piece that was a favorite of Geezer Butler, who would oftentimes during rehearsals play those three notes. Eventually, those tones got into Iommi's head, and so one day he came in with a riff using the tritone that would eventually become the song Black Sabbath. By using techniques like the tritone, Sabbath was able to create the ominous kind of horror movie-like atmosphere they were looking for, something that really sounded nothing like the standard hippie psychedelic music of the time. In fact, none other than James Hetfield of Metallica would describe Sabbath like this, quote, "Sabbath was everything that the 60s weren't. Their music was so cool because it was completely anti-hippie. I hated the Beatles, Jethro Tull, Love, and all that other hippie shit." The thing is, that's not to say that the members of Black Sabbath rejected the hippies' beliefs. Ozzy, for example, is well known for flashing the peace sign during performances. They just, rather than focusing on an idealized version of reality or some kind of utopia to come, instead chose to focus on the ugliness of the world as they knew it. Take, for example, the song War Pigs off their second album, which is a profoundly anti-Vietnam War and anti-war song in general, as it takes aim at the politicians responsible for all the death and destruction. With music like this, Sabbath would find an audience who, like the members of the band, were becoming disillusioned with the world, as they clashed with authority figures, and as the war in Vietnam continued to drag on. The mood of the world and the youth had changed into one of doom and aggression, and Black Sabbath would provide the perfect soundtrack to this changing attitude. Over across the tracks in the industrial side of Cream Country lie unskilled laborers like Black Sabbath, which was hyped as a rocking ritual celebration of the satanic mass or some such claptrap, something like England's Answer the Coven. Well, they're not that bad, but that's about all the credit you can give them. The whole album is a shock, despite the murky song titles and some inane lyrics that sound like Vanilla Fudge paying doggerel tribute to Aleister Crowley. The album has nothing to do with spiritualism, the occult, or anything much, except stiff recitations of Cream cliches that sound like the musicians learned them out of a book, grinding on and on with dogged persistence. Vocals are sparse, most of the album being filled with plodding bass lines, over which the lead guitar dribbles wooden Claptonisms from the mastered tired as Cream days. They even have discordant jams with bass and guitar reeling like velocitized speed freaks all over each other's musical perimeters, yet never quite finding sync. Just like Cream, but worse. That was a review written by Lester Bangs for Rolling Stones, starting a tradition in heavy metal of reviewers not liking or at least not getting it. While this wouldn't be the last negative review a heavy metal band would get, largely because the person doing the reviewing didn't understand the appeal, just getting to this point hadn't been an easy road either. Bassist Geezer Butler would recall, quote, "We used to do these auditions for record companies and they'd just leave after the third song or something. I'll always remember one producer told us to go away, learn how to play, and learn how to write some decent songs. We were rejected again and again by company after company, and then the management at the time had this great idea to write some pop songs, and it wasn't even us that wrote them. It was another band that he was managing who wrote them, and we hated doing them. You can tell that when you listen to them. Record labels told us to go